Welcome to the Voice of the Beginning, the Word of the Bible. Before we begin, help us spread the word. Subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share with those you love.
Imagine the heavy, dense, and suffocating silence that settled over the face of the earth, immediately following the dramatic exit from the Garden of Perfection. The world was still new, exhaling the fragrance of recent creation and the freshness of divine mornings. Yet for the first time, the human heart carried within its deepest chambers the thick, icy shadows of separation. Outside the walls of Eden, time began to march relentlessly, and under the watchful eyes of the first parents, Cain and Abel grew. They were not merely brothers by blood, fruits of the first love under the dawn's sun, but represented from the very beginning two distinct paths, two polarities of the human soul before the Creator. Cain, the firstborn and heir to Eve's great expectations, dedicated his existence to the mastery of matter and the grueling cultivation of the soil. He brought as an offering the fruit of his own exhaustive labor, the bitter result of the sweat of his brow on a land that, under the weight of the fall, no longer responded with the generosity of old, demanding instead raw strength and persistence. In his offering, he saw his own merit, an extension of his power over nature, and an attempt to prove his worth through manual toil. Abel, the shepherd, brought something else entirely: surrender, sacrifice, and the humble recognition of life as something belonging to God. His offering did not stem from what he produced, but from what he recognized as sacred, understanding that nothing he possessed was truly his own. The conflict that would forever alter the trajectory of humanity did not begin in the open field under the light of day nor in a fatal blow, but at the invisible altar of intent, the place where the Spirit communicates with the eternal. When God, who probes the most hidden depths of the human spirit, looked with favor upon Abel's offering but found no such purity or reverence in Cain's, a storm of resentment, comparison, and bitterness began to brew within the spirit of the elder brother. The sudden fall of Cain's countenance was the first outward sign of spiritual erosion, a deep crack in the mask of righteousness that revealed a devastating internal war between wounded pride and divine will. It was the human ego, for the first time in history, feeling stung by the light of a truth that accepts nothing less than the whole heart. In his infinite and merciful patience, God did not abandon Cain to his growing hatred. He descended to meet the man for a solemn dialogue of warning, a final opportunity for redemption before the abyss. He revealed that sin was not merely a future mistake, but a living presence crouching at the door like a hungry, prowling beast waiting for a single moment of weakness to dominate his will and devour his peace. The spiritual tone we must grasp and absorb here is the realization that the invisible mark of Cain begins long before the physical act of murder. It is born in the silence of the soul, in the secret nurturing of envy, in the stubborn refusal to master one's impulses, and in the spiritual blindness of failing to see a brother as a sacred extension of oneself. Cain allowed the beast to enter. He gave quarter to resentment, and by closing his ears to the sweet, firm voice of the Most High, he began to tread the dark and lonely path that would lead him from a simple farmer to the first deserter of humanity, transforming the very soil he tilled into the stage for the world's first great spiritual tragedy. The sacred soil of the earth, which by divine and eternal design was meant to be only a generous fountain of life, and the welcoming cradle of human sustenance, was suddenly transformed into the first, the most silent, and the most terrifying witness to absolute horror. At the exact moment when Cain, overcome by a dark fury that no longer belonged to the original human nature, raised his hand against Abel, he was not merely committing an act of physical violence against a body of flesh. He was, in reality, attempting to assassinate the very image and likeness of God that shone with unbearable light from his brother. By striking that fatal blow, Cain believed in his hate-clouded folly that he could forever silence the voice of righteousness that so disturbed his wounded conscience and extinguish the presence that served as a constant mirror to his own bitterness and spiritual emptiness. However, what he could never have foreseen in his blindness was that by attempting to snuff out a spark of life on earth, he would end up awakening an infinitely more powerful spiritual voice, a frequency impossible to be ignored by any creature or by the Creator himself. Abel's blood did not remain stagnant, forgotten, or mute in the dry and indifferent dust of the field. At that moment, it acquired a mystical resonance, an eternal vibration that cried out directly from the abyssal depths of the earth's soul to the attentive and zealous ears of the Most High, piercing through the dense layers of time-space and material reality itself. This pivotal and devastating moment in the history of the human soul represents the definitive awakening of consciousness to the absolute necessity of divine justice. When the Creator, in his majesty, breaks the silence of that field of death and asks Cain where Abel is, he does not do so out of any shadow of ignorance regarding the facts, for nothing escapes his gaze, nor out of a lack of omniscience. God asks the question in a gesture of final and extreme mercy, extending a bridge over the abyss, offering Cain a sacred space and a season of grace for sincere repentance, the unique opportunity to confess his burden before it became eternal. Yet Cain's response, dripping with icy sarcasm and defiant arrogance as he questioned if he was somehow his brother's keeper, reveals the ultimate spiritual disconnection a human being can reach in their fall. Sin, in its most destructive and virulent essence, makes us believe in the dangerous illusion that we are isolated islands, self-sufficient beings who owe nothing to anyone, devoid of any spiritual or moral responsibility for our neighbor. It blinds us to the fundamental truth that we are all branches of the same divine vine, beating to the same rhythm of creation. The persistent and deafening cry of Abel's blood is an eternal reminder to all generations that every action perpetrated against life does not end with the physical impact, but reverberates throughout eternity, irreversibly altering the delicate balance of the cosmos. For this reason, the ground was cursed for Cain, denying him its strength and fertility. Not out of a punitive whim from a distant judge or a fit of divine rage, but as an organic and inevitable spiritual consequence. The earth, created specifically to nourish and celebrate life, could no longer sustain in peace or offer rest and shelter to the one who profaned and stained it with the innocent blood of his own blood. From that crime forward nature and man entered into a profound and melancholy disharmony, signaling that to wound a brother is, essentially, to wound the very foundation of our existence and to sabotage the very ground upon which we stand. Throughout the millennia, countless scholars, theologians, and curious minds have delved into ancient manuscripts and oral traditions seeking a purely physical and tactile description of this supernatural phenomenon. They have desperately tried to decipher if the mark was an indelible tattoo etched by the finger of fire of the Creator, an archaic and mysterious letter engraved upon the forehead, a sudden alteration in skin pigmentation, or perhaps a spiritual scar that never closed and emanated a somber light. However, the true and profound essence of the Mark of Cain completely transcends any visual aesthetic, anatomical curiosity, or biological characteristic. It inhabits a realm of metaphysical meaning that is far more unsettling and revelatory. The Holy Scriptures tell us that God, in an act of sovereignty that frontally defies our limited human logic of eye for an eye retribution, placed a specific sign upon Cain so that absolutely no one, in any corner of the earth, would dare to kill him during his solitary and bitter journey of exile through the wild and unknown world. Spiritually, this mark must be understood as the supreme seal of the divine paradox, a mystical intersection where the severest justice and the most inexplicable mercy meet, merge, and converse. It functions simultaneously as a visible stigma of his terrible transgression and a constant reminder of shed blood, but also as a supernatural shield of insurmountable protection. It was by no means a sentence that condemned him to immediate death or delivered him to the fury of public lynching and the vengeance of the masses. On the contrary, it was a divine guarantee of survival, an unquestionable decree coming from the throne of the universe so that the final judgment over that soul remained exclusively in the hands of God and was not usurped by the flawed and equally sinful hands of men. The mark symbolizes the sacred limit and the impassable frontier that the Creator places upon the escalation of human violence, establishing a spiritual barrier against the cycle of chaos that Cain's sin unleashed upon the world. It speaks silently to the cosmos, to the nations, and to all spiritual forces. declaring that even the greatest of sinners, the one who committed the most heinous crime against his own blood, still remains under the direct jurisdiction, the constant vigilance, and the irrevocable ownership of the Most High. It is the sign that Cain's life, although deeply stained, fragmented and obscured by the shadows of evil, still held within it a hidden purpose, a mystery of existence, or at the very least, a time of waiting and reflection that only the eternal would have the absolute authority and the right to end. The mark of Cain is the seal that God does not give up his stewardship over human life, even when man, in his rebellion, gives up on following God. It transforms the first murderer into a living and wandering monument of divine patience. It serves as a reminder that as long as the mark of life pulses within a body, there still exists the remote possibility that time may produce some kind of spiritual response before the Creator who sees all and sustains all, preventing human justice from becoming as blind and cruel as the very crime it seeks to punish. Cain's true and most devastating punishment was never the physical mark pressed into his skin, no matter how mysterious or frightening it might have appeared to those who passed him. Instead, it was the hopeless and somber fate of being transformed into an eternal fugitive and a wanderer upon the face of an earth, that now in a silent response to the blood he shed denied him both shelter and rest. Spiritually, to be a wanderer is to suffer the greatest and deepest of all possible losses for a created being. The loss of the soul, center of gravity. It is the loss of the sacred place of repose, identity, and security that exists only within the glorious and welcoming presence of God. The biblical text reveals a geographical detail that actually carries a spiritual tragedy of cosmic proportions. Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and lived in the land of Nod. In the original language, Nod is not just a name on a map. It literally means the land of flight, of exile, of trembling, or of constant restlessness. This movement of Cain, turning his back on the face of the Creator, represents the ongoing fall of the man who, by rejecting the difficult path of repentance and confession, chooses the sterile isolation of self-sufficiency and pride. When we deliberately distance ourselves from the source of life, we invariably become nomads of the soul. We become somber and melancholy figures, wandering through existential deserts, seeking in geographical locations, fleeting pleasures, the accumulation of goods, or external achievements, the peace and fulfillment that can only be found in intimate and sincere communion with the Father. In a desperate attempt to fill the infinite abyss that opened in his chest after the crime, Cain became a great achiever in the material world. He designed and built imposing cities, sought to establish a lasting legacy through a powerful lineage, and invested in the technology, metallurgy, and arts of that primitive era to try and mask his deafening loneliness. However, no stone wall, no matter how high, and no civilizational advancement was capable of containing the coldness and the void of the spiritual exile that followed him like an intrusive and accusing shadow at every step. The mark on his forehead was the constant reminder at every dawn and every dusk that he was now a stranger to his own existence. He was a man who had the world at his feet, but did not possess himself. He became the definitive archetype of one who carries the crushing weight of his actions without ever finding an oasis of forgiveness to rest a weary heart. To be a wanderer, in Cain's context, is the terrible condemnation of having everything the earth can offer, except the presence that gives meaning to all that exists. It is the chronic fatigue of a soul that runs without stopping, not to reach a noble goal, but to try and escape a conscience that the divine mark does not allow to be erased or forgotten. Cain discovered in the most bitter and lonely way that without a connection to the sacred, the entire world becomes a hostile desert. Any city built by human hands is nothing more than a prison adorned with gold and bronze, where the spirit continues to wander hungry, thirsty, and exhausted for a home that he himself, in an act of rebellion, decided to abandon forever. This wandering was not merely physical, it was the walk of someone who is alive on the outside, but inhabits the territory of death within, seeking a peace that the earth, now stained, no longer has the power to give. At this crucial point in our spiritual journey through the mystery, we must pause to look with reverence and awe at the hidden beauty residing within the severity of God. If divine justice were merely pure, cold, and blind, operating only under the gears of immediate retribution, Cain would have perished and been erased from existence the very moment his brother's blood touched the ground. However, the imposition of the mark reveals something revolutionary about the character of the Eternal, the mercy that precedes the gospel itself. Here, in the opening pages of Genesis, we see God acting as the protector of the one who failed in the most catastrophic way possible. This teaches us a profound and timeless lesson that the Creator finds no pleasure in the destruction or death of the sinner, but fervently desires that he continue to live, even if that new existence is forever marked by the painful memory of the mistake and the weight of responsibility. The mark of Cain is, therefore, the first historical sign that God intervenes directly in the human narrative to interrupt and prevent an endless cycle of vengeance, blood, and hatred that could consume all of humanity in its cradle. By solemnly declaring that anyone who killed Cain would be punished sevenfold, God was not merely protecting an individual, but was establishing a spiritual and moral barrier against absolute chaos, preventing men from becoming judges and executioners of one another. Even when plunged into the dense darkness of Cain's crime, the light of divine preservation shone with an unexpected intensity. It is the definitive recognition that absolutely no one, no matter how far they have walked away or how deep their abyss may be, is so distant that God's guarding hand cannot reach them. This divine hand, which sustains the universe, extends toward the guilty, reminding us that God's care is not a prize for the perfect, but a refuge for the fallen. The mark is proof that God's discipline never aims for the end of man, but rather for the maintenance of life under the gaze of the one who governs all. Even while carrying the stigma of judgment, Cain carried the proof that God still cared about what would happen to him, revealing that grace does not negate the consequence, but prevents the consequence from becoming the final point of human history under the sun. The script of the entire vast and complex human story concludes not in the desolate tragedy of the desert or the void of oblivion, but by pointing with unshakable and radiant hope toward the definitive overcoming of every stigma, every scar, and every deep-seated pain. We must understand the contrast that defines our existence. While the original mark of Cain served only as a physical and external protection for the body, ensuring that biological life was not cut short, it still kept the spirit imprisoned in a bitter, icy, and solitary exile far from the warmth of the divine face. However, centuries later, on the exact horizon of eternity and at the geographic center of human pain, a new sign emerged. It was a new mark that would forever change the destiny of every wandering soul that has ever stepped upon this stained soil. The blood of Abel, spilled in the raw dust of the field, cried out incessantly for justice and vengeance, creating an echo of condemnation and fear that pierced through millennia and generations, reminding man of his unpayable debt. But the Scriptures, in a glorious turning point that defies human logic, reveal to us that the blood of Christ cries out for things infinitely superior, sweeter and deeper than retribution. There is a mystical and unbreakable bridge linking the first crime committed at the dawn of time to the final redemption offered in the sunset of the cross. While Cain was marked by compulsion so as not to be killed, carrying the sign of preservation in the midst of the shame of his act, Christ was voluntarily marked by raw wounds in his feet, his hands, and his side. He allowed his body to be broken so that we, the spiritual descendants of so many errors and omissions, could finally live fully, freely, and abundantly. True spiritual redemption is exactly this sacred and alchemical process of transforming the mark of shame, sin, and isolation into the mark of victory, adoption, and absolute peace. The spiritual invitation that echoes today with renewed strength for anyone who feels exactly like Cain, like a fugitive exhausted of himself, a wanderer without a spiritual homeland and tired of carrying the unbearable weight of his own choices, is the immediate return to the Garden of Communion. This garden is no longer a geographical space guarded by angels, but a state of eternal rest in the spirit. We no longer need to wander without direction or hope through the land of Nod, through the land of restlessness. Trembling and anxiety for the path that was blocked by flaming swords has been reopened once and for all by the sacrifice of supreme love. The mark that once separated us from the Father's face, which labeled us as deserters of the light and distanced us from holiness, is now replaced by the indestructible and luminous seal of the Holy Spirit. This seal no longer identifies us as fugitives, outcasts, or strangers, but recognizes us as beloved children who are finally crossing the threshold of home after a long, dark, and rigorous winter night of the soul. The end of Cain's agonizing journey is, ultimately, the invitation to the triumphant beginning of our own journey back to real and deep rest in the pulsing heart of the Creator. It is the sacred moment when we stop being guardians of our own lies and resentments to become guardians of the light we have received by grace. The spiritual exile is over. The mark of biological protection has become the seal of eternal salvation. And the voice that once cried from the ground for vengeance now sings in heavenly choirs that the child who was lost has finally found his safe harbor, his final rest, and his eternal place of belonging. You are no longer defined by what you did in the field, but by what was done for you on the altar of history.
May this word take root in your spirit and guide your steps. If this message spoke to you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.